All right. David Townsend, thank you again so much for doing this, man. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an honor for you to ask, and I'm happy to be a part of this.
Yeah, awesome. Well, hey, for people who don't know you, can you give just a little bit of a background of who you are, maybe how you came to Christ, and then what you're doing right now?
Yeah. So, um, long story short, if you will, when I was in high school, I started really feeling strong desires to have purpose, and I began to kind of find my identity in a lot of other things, and I was really searching for what would satisfy. And around the time that I had turned 18, and shortly thereafter, um, I had a lot of exposure from the church to just the community. There was a lot of Bible Belt Christianity, a lot of it nominal, but still a lot of exposure to the gospel my entire life. So it wasn't unfamiliar to me, but it wasn't also something that I really was, I'd say, walking in faith in. So for me, I began to really be dissatisfied with life and with the person I was becoming. And so I just was searching, and I knew I could read the Bible, and I had always felt as if God was calling for me, and because again I had heard the gospel preached at me, and towards me, and I always, at least as a kid, recognized at least what from what I could know with from being kind of on the outside looking in, that I recognized the God of the Bible as the true God, and as the creator God. So there was no like agnosticism or atheism, but functionally I wasn't following Jesus. And so it wasn't as if I had to search very long, but still, nonetheless, I was looking for satisfaction and identity in things. And I began to read the Bible, and it cut me. I realized really quickly it knew more about me than I knew about myself, and it felt alive. And so I knew, just from reading the words of Jesus, that he required a faith that changes your entire life. That to really believe he is who he says he is requires a denying of self, a trusting in him, and following in obedience. And so it just felt like he was saying, put it down, like lay aside yourself and follow me. And so from then on, it was hard for me. I was so radically changed, and I experienced grace and forgiveness in such a way that it was hard for me to see that nominal culture that I had grown up within, and see that was real Christianity. I couldn't look at that anymore and say, no, that's real, because of what I was reading in the Word now. And so I really had a lot of zeal. Some of it was through immaturity and naivety, but nonetheless, I felt called to ministry of some sorts, but I really didn't know what that looked like. And in my mind, again, because of just immaturity and youthful zeal, I thought, well, there's two options, pastor or missionary. And so I was, entering into college at this time. So for me, it was like, well, I don't want to be a pastor. So I guess, I guess there's another option. And I was actually first semester while in undergraduate, I participated in this extracurricular class called Perspectives, and it's a global missions course that a lot of churches nationwide will host, and you can pay to have it function as class credit, say at a seminary, or you can audit it or whatever. And I had a friend who at this point in first semester college, I'd kind of locked arms with Christian community. And so at this point, I had a friend who actually paid my way in, and that was when I was really exposed to the Great Commission for the first time. And so from then on out, I was like, hey, I want to be an overseas missionary. And so the whole goal and everything I did really in college, as far as like the classes I took, to just what kind of training I was seeking and what I was giving myself to, was for that intent. purpose. And from there, it was decided, hey, I know of a great seminary that sends a lot of missionaries. In fact, they're one of the better known Southern Baptist seminaries for overseas missions, international missions. And so that was that all like framed my goal. And it happened there that I'd met my now wife, Caitlin, and we were set up, really. I was in this program to serve overseas with the International Mission Board. But actually my grandmother was diagnosed with dementia in 2014, and I'm her only grandchild, and her next of kin. So I became her caretaker, and that threw a wrench in the cogs, if you will. And because of that, I had to really take some time to consider how God was moving in mine and my wife's lives at that point. I mean, we had been married for less than a year, and we had a really deep desire and a really heavy burden to serve the most unreached of places, those that were both unreached and unengaged. And so if you're into missiology and looking at those type of statistics, often those locations are within the 1040 window. And so we had a great desire to serve in just a place with great need. And anyway, it couldn't happen. I remember distinctly like praying to the Lord, hey, will you please still send me and take care of my grandmother. And it was clear. I was reading one morning, and in 1 Timothy 5, Paul basically says, hey, remind your people that a man who doesn't take care of his family, he's worse than an unbeliever. And I knew that that meant I had to stay. And so from then on out, it was, well, what am I going to do now? And we had some close friends that were planting a church in Vermont. We had already planned to visit them and things like that. And so a little bit later that year, we visited Vermont, a town called Brattleboro, which, hey, surprise, it's the town I'm in right now. And we joined the work there. And not too long after that, just because of partnering in ministry, I became one of the pastors at Rivertown Church here in Brattleboro, Vermont. So, it was for many who are in full-time ministry, at least from the Bible Belt, they either maybe felt that at a young age or had a story of coming to faith at a young age. And certainly I was exposed to the gospel, but I don't think it wasn't until late in life where I really heeded the words of Jesus to deny myself, and certainly that's an everyday thing. It's an everyday choice, right? It's not a one-time thing, but that type of resolve didn't happen, at least in my life, till I was 18.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because I think that your story kind of parallels my own just a little bit, because I also didn't really take seriously the call of Christ until late in high school as well. And I kind of had the exact same thought. Like, I knew that I wanted to be in ministry, but I was like, man, I don't really want to be here in the Bible Belt. But the only exposure to like missionary work really was doctors. And I was like, I'm too stupid to be a doctor, that's for sure. And then it was like this old Sunday school book where you kind of see this old-timey missionary with like all dressed in white. And I was just like, I don't know if I want to just wear white robes all the time. So I don't know what I'm going to do. But so it wasn't until a little bit later that I realized how dumb I was there. But so when it came to your transition to Vermont, did you know beforehand the need in Vermont? And if you could kind of explain the need that is in Vermont.
Yeah, so I knew, at the very least, I knew that New England was not like the South. And I also, I had traveled quite a bit throughout college. So, and again, because of the perspectives class, I was aware of ideas like contextualization and understanding that someone's experience will often, it certainly will dictate how they view the world. And, I was never like naive enough to not think that even throughout other pockets or regions of North America, you wouldn't find conflicting views with how the world works. And so it wasn't a surprise to understand kind of where New England at large sits on an ideological map, if you want to use that language. But I knew. But what really did blow my mind was I had a friend in undergrad who she had participated in just a type of mission trip to Boston, and I was asking about it, and she said, yeah, technically, at one point, Boston was considered unreached because the Joshua Project, which is a missions type agency, I don't think they send out, but they're a data collection type ministry, and so they provide data, surveys, insight into the various cultures of the world. And they actually have the rule of thumb is, hey, if it's 2% or less of an evangelical Christian population, it's considered unreached. And so at one point, Boston, Massachusetts, right, was considered unreached per that marker. And so that was really mind blowing to me. And so that happened that conversation and that insight, that aha moment happened years before Vermont was even a consideration. But so when our close friends began talking about how they felt burdened for Vermont, at that point, we still felt strongly about overseas work, but it was like a kindred feeling regarding look, we both want to reach places that have a great need and have not a lot of gospel servants, like gospel workers. And so when overseas work was taken off the table, it was really just a simple well, let's go to the next place we can that has great need for the gospel. And so it was really just the logical next step for us. From my perspective, I mean, certainly my wife and I had to pray and consider and really ask, is this where you're sending us, Lord? But it seemed so fitting because and again, I think you have to be sensitive to the Spirit in this, because there are many dudes called to stay with their families in Bible Belt America, and to faithfully feed the sheep. And so, and that's real. And I never want to belittle or make it seem like it's less than ideal work. But my wife and I both knew that we were being called to a place that needed the gospel to be proclaimed, a place that had few workers. And so when the prospects of Vermont came about, it wasn't difficult to say yes. I'll put it that way. But as far as the transition goes, it was a year between deciding, or really hearing the call, I should say, and saying yes to that. From there, it was roughly a year till we were actually kind of had boots on the ground, and it was a long year. We were anxious, but we knew it was coming, and so we just continued to be faithful as best as we could in serving the church that we were at, and just preparing financially and all the other things that you have to do when you kind of uproot your lives and plant them elsewhere. So, but it wasn't because we had friends here, and it certainly probably wasn't as difficult or life altering as it could be for people who go alone, or people who are maybe the first Christians in an area, right? I mean, even though it's an area of great need, people are familiar with Christianity, even if they have a completely backwards view of it. And if there's, because there's a lot of biblical ignorance here, or what we'd call biblical illiteracy, right? There are folks guaranteed in this town who they may have heard the name of Jesus, but they have no clue what it means, or what even the story of Jesus dying, and coming and resurrecting is about. So that's real. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. And I mean, I know people that have never ever really heard the gospel. So, but again, there is some exposure to Christianity just because of where we're at, and there's a history of the church being here. So it wasn't all that life altering in that regard, but it was still pretty shocking. I mean, there's a lot of just nuances to life in New England that are different than the South, and some are really refreshing. Little stuff like, say, I think you always have to consider what you dress and how you dress and how you look in public in the South, and no one cares here. So it's kind of nice to not know, or to know that no one actually cares how you dress, and no one, and I mean it, no one's judging you if you have clothes with holes in them or anything like that. It just doesn't matter here. And some of that's unique to this town in Vermont. There are other parts of New England, of course, that are incredibly different, like more wealthier areas. But yeah, just little cultural nuances that you tend to you forget about. But when I go back to the South, it's like, whoa, this is different.
Right.
And just some things that are kind of inconsequential, but still are different. Everyone recycles here, and which is great. But you get so used to it because it's a habit of separating in public, restaurants and things, that you go to the South and you see everyone tossing their cans and their bottles, and you kind of looking for where's the other recycling bin,
Right.
and stuff like that. But as a whole, people communicate differently here. There's a different kind of understanding about how you communicate with another. There's not a lot of facade. Most people are incredibly blunt or frank, with you, which is refreshing. And I think, what might be called Southern hospitality certainly doesn't exist here, right? So
Sure,
you might not have what you would consider good service in a restaurant if you're comparing it to Southern hospitality. But again, it's just different. It's not that it's bad; it's just different. So
yeah, for sure. And with talking with you and some of the other people up in Vermont, it's kind of reminiscent to the time that Kayla and I spent in Germany, working there, because people in Germany they're totally fine with telling you exactly how they think and exactly what they think of what you're wearing. I tried to go to the store one time, and I think I was just wearing sweatpants, but they were just like workout pants, and I was like, these look kind of nice, so I'll be fine. And we were living with a family at the time, and the husband just pointed at me and said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm just going down to the store." And he said, "You're not putting on pants?" And I was like, "I've got pants on. These look pretty nice, right?" And he's like, "No, you need to go change." I was like, "I'm just going to the store. I'm just walking 5 feet to the store." But yeah, that's something that we're looking forward to as well. It's just it can be, you have to be, at least in Germany, you had to be kind of careful that you didn't get your feelings hurt, that you weren't too sensitive, because they were just being honest. But yeah. So when it comes to Brattleboro, is there like one specific kind of worldview that the majority of people that you speak with have, or is there kind of like a myriad of different worldviews that you have to kind of contend with?
Yeah, you can kind of find anything under the sun here. It's certainly eclectic, to say the least. You will find, I think, pockets of ideas in various parts of Brattleboro. So if you were to venture downtown, as you would probably imagine, it's like incredibly liberal ideologically. And so I don't necessarily mean politically, even though they often coincide. But as far as like what is truth, that type of question, many would say, hey, it doesn't exist, right? What's true for you is true for you, and for me. And you would just have people who really love being a part of a greater cause. So we often have a lot of protests, or like little mini strikes walking down the street, because people really want to, I think, belong to something that's greater than themselves. And there's a lot of emphasis on community. In fact, that's one of the better things. I think, when you travel as a believer, you often should, in my opinion, look for the redemptive qualities of a culture, especially if you're looking to engage people with the gospel. There needs to be some type of tie-in, right, or some type of kind of diving board, so that you can move the conversation towards Jesus. And so I think one of the really neat redemptive qualities or characteristics of Vermont is that community is huge. People want to belong to community, and so neighborliness is typically pretty good. And
Mhm.
I think people are better neighbors here than at least what I experienced in the South. And people want to have this kind of unified effort at having a good town, you know?
Mhm.
And so it's really refreshing in that regard. Certainly, you know, there's kind of no eternal perspective in most people's views of this stuff. And so
Mhm.
it's not satisfying every, needs. It certainly, it can't, but at least you see there's a hunger for that and a desire for it, because I think that, biblically we have good reason to think that that's part of God's design, that we would
Mhm.
live in community, certainly knowing that the Trinity is its own community, right? We too were designed to be a part of community. And so there's really neat stuff like that throughout Vermont, and particularly in Brattleboro. Another thing, though, as far as like pockets, you might go to the outside of town and you would, find neighborhoods where you have your more blue collar to just more normal working class citizens, who are just trying to get by. And
Mhm.
they tolerate maybe a lot of the kind of left-sided things that happen downtown, and they
Mhm.
may sympathize, they may oppose it, or they may just not care. And so, and that's really more of your bread and butter, I think, of Brattleboro. But it's the people that are the loudest are those who are often kind of change the perception um, of what this town looks like, or how people see the town. And but yeah, you can find stuff all over the map as far as new age ideals to just, hey, I'm a hardworking person just trying to get by, right?
Mhm.
So it's all over the map here.
Yeah. So like this podcast kind of focuses a lot on apologetics. And so
Sure.
when it comes to speaking with people from these eclectic worldviews, do you have like a specific method when it comes to speaking with one of these blue collar people versus one of these, I guess more, I guess new agey type people that you may find more downtown, or does it kind of stay about the same?
it, I think I think it depends way less on um, what you initially perceive about a person, and it's far more dependent on what your conversation looks like as you engage them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think everyone deserves to be listened to, and I've we've me and certainly like the guys that I pastor with, and even others in our church have had conversations with all types of people, and it's inevitable, right, in a town like this. But but as far as a particular method, no. I think the biggest thing is being having enough, like, how should I say, worldview fluency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cultural fluency
Mm-hmm.
to know how to like to not be surprised at some of the things you hear, and
Right.
also how to navigate through them. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like one of the, like, just to give an example, this town has a lot of new age or non-Western medicine, right? So you can go downtown and see a lot of acupuncture clinics or other types of non-traditional healing and things like that. And for those people, it's like it's a worldview, right?
Mm-hmm.
It usually it's tied not just into some type of healing practice, but in how you actually view the world and function within it. So I think it's important, because I would be foolish to think like that I am a master of of knowing all the intricacies of every person's worldviews,
Mm-hmm.
and it's you know it's clear failures and things like that. So it would be foolish for me to even consider that. So I just try to listen,
Mm-hmm.
and if I have the opportunity to like question, then I always will, because I think one of the biggest things is to in gentleness show them, right, the holes in maybe their own thinking,
Mm-hmm.
where things fall short for them. And even if it's just as simple like asking a question in gentleness, right? Because I think Jesus often did this. He would question the scribes who first questioned him. And he would often ask rhetorical questions, or often say things with hyperbole to make points. And they, for the most part, right, Jesus never used personal attacks, with the exception of maybe against some Pharisees. But these people certainly aren't that, right? They're not claiming to be hyper religious or anything like that. They're looking for truth. And so I think one of my roles as just being a witness or a herald of the gospel is to identify where a person might be on a spectrum, if we want to use that illustration. So if 0 were, hey, total unbelief, right, and 10 were belief. That's a limited illustration, but I think you can follow along. It's my goal would be to move someone along that spectrum, so that they grow in dissatisfaction with what they currently believe and how they currently see the world, and begin to hunger and thirst for truth, and for people that I have an ongoing relationship, I share the gospel, and I continue to share the gospel, because I have coworkers and friends in the community who all have beliefs that are across the spectrum, if you will. And so it's as simple as identifying, like, what is it that's keeping you from acknowledging Jesus as Lord, and hopefully having a conversation that moves you along, to go from, hey, total rejection to consideration. And if you're already at consideration, hey, like, look, I'm going to warn you that Jesus is like, he came in grace at his first coming, but his second coming won't be the same, And right. So it's really just identifying where someone might be, and moving them along that spectrum. And there's no method, but I think that framework, you can go from there if you're a good listener and you're at least versed enough in how many of the popular beliefs in your area operate to navigate things. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said is so important, because I think that a lot of people, before they will go out and evangelize, they think they have to know the ins and outs of every single worldview that ever was, because if they aren't able to, I guess, answer the questions that, a Muslim may have, or a Buddhist may have, or what have you, then they're not going to be able to, they're not going to be able to function within the conversation. But I think what you said about being a listener first, and then asking specific questions, or just being good at asking questions in general. Like, one of the greatest tools that I've found when it comes to sharing my faith is just being able to ask them the question, why? Why do you believe what you believe? And just kind of different variants of that. And like you said, it starts kind of, it's like using the Socratic method, right? It just kind of starts showing them the shortcomings of their own worldview. And it's, I think that's unbelievably important, because I think a lot of Christians want to just start off with them having all of the answers and them having all the things to say, when I think sometimes, just like you said, we need to kind of be good listeners first, before we speak.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what's the average perception of Christianity where you are? Like, is it a positive thing? Is it a negative thing? Is it kind of like a confused thing even?
That's a difficult question to answer, because it depends on who you ask.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's across the board, certainly. I think some people may say, hey, I know someone that's a Christian. They're a nice person. So that sounds good to me. Others may, because you're at least, quote unquote religious, they may trust you. And others may be incredibly they'll just be incredulous, towards you because of Christianity. Maybe they were burned by the church at one point, or perhaps, I don't know, maybe in some other type of experience caused them to have a really bad taste in their mouth. And so there has been hostility. We as a church have seen great hostility towards Christianity aimed at us. And it particularly now, where, at least in politics, the term evangelical is often associated with right-wing politics. It's a little bit more difficult in an area like this, where it wouldn't take much more than a quick Google search to see that this area is incredibly liberal, politically speaking. And so there is a disdain for anything associated with the right. And yeah, there are right-wing voters and stuff like here, but they're not very vocal, right? Because the majority are left. And again, I just give this as an illustration, or really to make the point that if evangelicalism is associated with the right, then all of a sudden you're at a worse place as far as rapport, trust, and just starting a conversation, because there are very hostile feelings towards the opposite spectrum politically here. So it that can be incredibly difficult, and so navigating that and like really just letting people know that, hey, my my allegiance is to Jesus and not to some political system, right? Not it's not even to this country, right? It's to Jesus, and I'm going to live in such a way that shows allegiance to him and his kingdom. And so for a lot of people that we get to spend time with and that we get to live in front of, they see that, and we've seen hearts become softened because of that. And but there are a lot of people in this community that they don't like us, and so and they don't know us, but they don't like us. So we see it all.
Yeah. Well, this is kind of going back a step, but so one of the things that, and from taking your missiological classes, but one of the things that when I first moved to Germany that I had to deal with, and a lot of church planners and missionaries have to deal with, is culture shock. Was there a culture shock for you guys moving from being, right in the middle of the Bible Belt to being someplace like you are now?
Yes and no. I traveled a lot in undergrad for short-term trips. So like, as far as going from like the polar opposite of America to some other country, I had experienced that, and my wife as well. So we already were preparing ourselves to live and function within some sort of culture shock, but it was way more subtle, right? And so because we had already visited here and we had been in communication with friends that already lived here, we just knew we were ready and anticipatory for a lot of things. But some stuff still kind of just blows your mind every once in a while, and it's little. I mean, I wouldn't call it petty, but it is little, and it's not really, it's not a big deal as far as like understanding where a person comes from. But it's the one thing that really kind of took me for a surprise is actually language, because do I know people use cuss words or anything like? Of course, but in the South at least, people don't use certain words around children, and that's not the case here. And so just isn't. I mean, and it doesn't.
Right.
Like I heard the spectrum as a kid and growing up in the South. It's not like I was sheltered from any of that, but there's certain just kind of things regarding language are taboo in the South, and it's how you speak in public, and especially around children. And I remember I was working a job, and I'm bivocational, what some people call co-vocational. And so one job I had when I first moved up here, I was there, and this guy was just really, really laying into it, and there were small children around, and I was like, and it made me feel uncomfortable, but not because I was offended by the words, but it just surprised me. And I just wasn't, it was something little like that, but it still kind of blew my mind. But the big things we were all pretty ready for, like cross-dressing or
Sure.
little clothes at all. A lot of people like to show what they can in Brattleboro. It's a very, very like ex-hippie type place. So none of that stuff was a surprise because we knew it. But so some of the little things, the nuances.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about your church plant that you work at, about Rivertown, and how you guys approach the community, about how you guys function as a church plant, all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah, so just a few weeks ago, we celebrated our 5th-year anniversary at having a public gathering, and so that's been cool. But over the course of those 5 years, things first started in one of our other pastors, Ben. Things started in his home, and then from there, things grew pretty quickly. I wasn't I wasn't here just yet, but when we first visited it to kind of have a vision trip and really see if this is a place we could serve, the church had just started meeting in a canoe shop, so we were renting space there, and then from there we were we're now in a building that we rent, but that so that does tie into kind of what I'll share here. I think one of the goals initially, and I don't want to speak because we function with a plurality of elders. So I'm one of 4 elders, pastors. We use those terms interchangeably. Okay, so I'm one of 4 pastors, and because I wasn't on ground at the start, I don't want to speak for them. But knowing and certainly being close with them, I do know that there was certainly a heart for being as organic as possible, right? And seeing, like, having these ideals, because all of us had convictions about serving overseas for the most part. And so we all kind of had some presuppositions about what it would look like and what an ideal church plant should look like. But interestingly enough, as you grow, and we're not a huge church by any means, but as you grow, you need structure, you need framework. And, I'm sure you've heard of the trellis and the vine illustration, right? The vine needs some type of lattice work from which to anchor to and grow. And so a lot of things that seemed, it's kind of pushing against my organic, convictions, right? They're just necessary. And so I would say that in that regard, we look a lot of like any other church maybe in the South, in that we have a service that meets on Sundays. It follows a fairly typical pattern of, we have a call to worship, a time of singing, a time of giving, a sermon, right? And then more singing, and then we close out with a benediction of some sort. And monthly we take the Lord's Supper and things like that. But we are a Baptist church, so we adhere to the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And I think though what would be different, and what we really try to aim for, is having rhythms within the week for our people to invest in one another and for people to live life together. So we split up our kind of, we call, like, the Sunday morning thing the gathered people, and then we become the scattered people of God. And so we have what we call missional communities throughout the week, and they're set up geographically. So each neighborhood, if you will, if they're, not that every neighborhood in town has one, but for each one that we have, intentionally set up geographically in a neighborhood. And then I'm actually our discipleship pastor, so we have both men's specific and women's specific discipleship groups. And depending on the needs of a group, we might have some seeker studies, because we have most of our congregation is made up of young believers, like new converts, or even some seekers, people who would not yet confess Jesus, but who want community. They desire it, and they see there's something distinct, something unusual with us. And so that's pretty cool. It's also one of those things that we have to, because it happens so regularly here, actually, where we'll have people among us regularly, but they're still not believers. We kind of have to stay fresh, and like hey, like, when are you gonna stop living for yourself and live for King, And so it keeps us on our toes in that regard. There's never really like business as usual, which is such a good thing, I think, and it's grace. So we're always looking to just see change and see growth and see transformation in us and in our people. But yeah, so we have those weekly rhythms. So intimate groups that we just call discipleship groups that are, where people read the word together. They'll read helpful discipleship books together. They certainly pray together, and it's really a format for training and really for equipping others to then lead other people to Jesus, and then lead other discipleship groups. And then our missional communities function on rhythms of up, in, and out. So, as you would imagine, up is praise, worship, adoration towards the Father. So it might be a night of reading the word and really just kind of joining our hearts together. In would be a night where we really focus on praying for one another, and again, like just being the body. And then out would be a rhythm where, hey, let's invite all the neighbors on this road over to have dinner with us. And like we'll pray for the food or something, but we won't Jesus juke anybody. It won't be a bait and switch. It'll just be let's genuinely love our community. And so we try to do as many things outside of the walls of that building as possible. But we also value what it means to be the gathered people of God. And so, yeah, in a lot of ways, it looks like another church, right? Any other church, but we just want to exalt Jesus and make sure that people know that this isn't just something for a Sunday, but this is your life, right? This is something that we give ourselves to because it's God's design, and it's we're His people for His possession, and that's why we do these things. And so that's kind of always the flavor or the thrust of how we function as a church. If that answers kind of the question.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing. It's really encouraging to hear stories from you, story from Ben. It's just, it makes me excited, and I know that it'll probably make everybody who's listening excited too. That to see that God is active in these places. It's so encouraging. The last question that I've got for you is: so, what advice would you give someone who was in your shoes a few years ago, who is thinking about doing church planting in Vermont or just New England in general, or just church planting in general, someplace that may not be the Bible Belt? What kind of advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to work through is just be realistic about how God works and how He's even worked in your own life, because especially when you're shepherding other people, it's easy to be frustrated at the sins that continually cause people to stumble, or just like the things that you think, hey, how come you haven't like gotten beyond this yet, or like, hey, I've been preaching this for this long now and you're still asking, like yet.
Yeah.
It's like, the light bulb came on like 6 months too late, stuff like that.
Right.
So I think we have to remember that Jesus is gracious, and if I look at my own life and see just His hand on my life, even in the past 11 years, it is a reminder that sanctification is only going to happen by the strength and the power of the Spirit and in His timing. And He's gracious, and He certainly disciplines us, but His ways are not ours. And work happens incredibly slowly in New England. There's so much baggage. We have a culture just filled with broken families and really broken ideas of what life should look like. And so we're seeing people come to Jesus, and we're seeing people like let go of the things that ensnare them. And it can be like a history of sexual violence and abuse. It could be a history of substance abuse. And these things, sometimes God works in really big ways, and things get dropped, at the drop of a hat. But for the most part, it takes time. It takes persistence. It takes long suffering, and it takes faith, because we're banking that the Spirit's going to do what Jesus says He's going to do. And so that'd be my encouragement: is know that nothing is going to happen quickly. And I think, and really the other thing too, is as you're pastoring people, you have to continually remind yourself and them that God's more concerned with our holiness as his ambassadors than he is our happiness. And so, man, we're just, I think if we're aiming to be comfortable and like feeling like we're doing a good job according to like our, parameters of success, we're missing the boat. Yeah. So, and I don't say any of that to sound like, fatalistic or anything, but I think when you can savor Jesus in the midst of just not ideal pastoring or a culture that literally thinks you're evil, right? We recently had some folks in the community accuse us of some crazy stuff as a church. And it was just a time to be reminded that Jesus says, look, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. And so, we can actually take courage in that because it's proof that we're being conformed to the image of God, And so, yeah, persist, right? Suffer well and learn how to endure. And as our character as ministers is continually proven, we'll be able to see and savor the hope that we have in Jesus all the more clearly.
Yeah. Well, David, this has been amazing. How can people keep up with you and also Rivertown Church? Where can they go to find that out?
Well, so I do a really terrible job of doing any type of updates. I'll be honest.
Me too. I'm not good at it.
Yeah, but if you really wanted to at all know what's going on in the life of Rivertown, you can go to our website, rivertownchurch.org. We regularly post sermons. Our sermon schedule rotates, so you'll get to hear sermons from all four of the pastors there. So that's a good place to look. And then anyone's welcome to follow me on Instagram, or I don't use Twitter anymore. That's a time capsule. But anybody can do that, or email me, david@rivertownchurch.org. I'd be happy to respond to any email that's just looking to say, hey, how's ministry looking? What are ways we can pray for you? Or anything like that. Like, I'd be happy to answer any of those emails. So david@rivertownchurch.org.
Fantastic. Man, this was so encouraging. Thank you so much again, David.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael.
Have a good one.
Hey, you too. Take care.